My name is Amy Garrettson. I'm the Education and Community Outreach Coordinator right here in Rochester at the Rochester Art Center. So a little bit about the Rochester Art Center. We're a contemporary art museum located in downtown Rochester along the Zumbro River. We were founded in 1946, and the Art Center hosts an ongoing schedule of exhibitions. We produce works by local, regional, national, and international artists. We also offer education programs, which I get to play in and work very closely with for all ages, especially the programs for the young kids, really close to my heart, as well as an array of community partnerships and visitor engagement initiatives. Through world-class exhibitions and programs, the Art Center presents a welcoming, integrated, and diverse experience that encourages questioning, creativity, and critical thinking. So I'm so thrilled to be able to spend my days working for the Rochester Art Center Contemporary Art Museum. So currently at the Art Center, we have a wonderful exhibition called Walk With Us, and that is on view now through October 3rd of 2022. So make sure to join us in Rochester in person to see that exhibition. Walk With Us is an international juried exhibition of walking-based art presented in non-gallery spaces. So think elevator bays, hallways, alcoves, kind of non-traditional type spaces throughout the Art Center. Jurors Zoe Chanel and John Schuerman are curators as well as artists with walking-based artistic practices, and they've selected 15 artists from a pool of about 87 international applicants. The selected walking projects expand our ideas of art, place, mapping, culture, and our inner and outer experience, and generally honor the simple act of walking. So you can read more about that on our website, rochesterartcenter.org. It's a really beautiful exhibition. I've really enjoyed the pieces I've gotten to engage with thus far, and I definitely look forward to engaging with more. So without further ado, I would love to introduce curator and juror of Walk With Us and author, John Schuerman. John, feel free to take it away.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us on Sunday morning here. And, I really appreciate the chance to do this because it certainly informs how I think about the work and what I might do next. So, just appreciate everybody participating. So I'll just kind of fill you in for my plan for the next hour. I think I'll talk for 10 or 15 minutes about the book, and then hopefully we can just kind of open it up to be a conversation between people here in the Zoom room. And if you have a question or a comment that you'd like us to respond to or to consider, just type it in the chat, and we'll do that. And if we don't have a lot of things in the chat item to talk about, I'll just open it up, and if we still don't have questions, I'll tell more stories. So that's kind of the day. So when I was thinking about the book, one of the things that I thought about was that it's really about this one moment in time. And, it was this moment of time between the spring of 2020 and spring of 2021. And a lot of stuff happened, and it was kind of a crazy period of time, which of course is spilling forward. And, it doesn't look like, that's going to unwind anytime soon, just because there's a lot of pressures globally, locally, nationally. But still, that book is just a snapshot. It's a moment in time. And I started to think about it kind of like a live album that captures a certain moment in time. And maybe more specifically like a live album of field recordings, where each walk is a field recording that has maybe more or less degrees of improvisation embedded in it, right? So in some walks, I'm an agent in the equation. So I'm making things happen as things are happening in the community that I'm walking in. And so, that was an interesting shift for me to make as an artist. I have for many years, I've been working in drawing and painting, and there's been a distance between myself and the object of what I'm rendering, and that was fine. But during this sort of crazy period in time, I felt like I needed to be more at the center of things, and that just sort of happened naturally. I didn't think, oh yeah, that's what I'm going to do. But I felt like I wanted to have a way to participate in what was going on, and find a way for me to add my voice to the rest of the voices in the community. So that's been a big step from distant observer to being in the center of what's happening. I suppose it's the difference of, right, like if you're taking photographs of others versus yourself, in the situation of what's happening. So that was one thing. A second thing that I've just been thinking a lot about lately is when I do a walk, I feel the change inside my body. And I haven't been consciously aware that that's what I'm doing, but that is part of what I'm doing. And so now, of course, I want to experiment with doing it consciously. And the second thing is that I feel the distance between myself and the situation, or the distance between myself and the other people in the situation. In some cases, they may be bystanders, or they may be victims, or they may be perpetrators, or whatever. But I think about what is the distance between me and who I am and my privilege and how I think, and other people in the community, which is sort of hinged around this walk. And yeah, so that's helpful. And I guess even so now I've started to do just some movement-based work. So it's not walking exactly, but once again, I can sort of feel inside of me, like when I perform this movement, what is the change that happens? Like, can I feel that change? And of course, that stuff's, it's pretty hard to, maybe it's not artwork, I don't know. But I think it's helpful to me as I think about this stuff. And I guess another aspect of it is I like the speed of walking. It's not too fast, so that I can still observe what's happening, and it's not too slow so that I feel like I'm doing nothing. And I've talked about this with, I think, some of you. It's observational speed, and I think that is really, it feels like a good place for me to be as an artist. So I work with that. Another thing that I think about in this work is the power and the limits of symbolic action. So when I decide that I'm going to walk to the next murder site in Minneapolis, and I do that walk, and I have an experience about it, one could argue that nothing happens, right? Like it's a very weak lever for change in our community. And, I certainly feel that, right? Like, that's part of the pain of and frustration of doing that kind of walk is that it's like, is this ever going to change? It's not like we don't know what to do, right? Like we know how to fix this, we just won't do it. But I think, of course, there are changes inside of me, and there are potential changes for other people, when I share those stories or when I share the story of the walk. Hopefully something is interesting for others too. And I also know that there are examples where symbolic action has changed the world, right? So when Tommy Smith and John Carlos did the Black Power salute at the '68 Olympics, that was a shot that went around the world and still reverberates today. It was a symbolic act. Now I don't have any delusions that some simple walk that I'm going to take is going to have that kind of effect. But I do think that there is some sort of power that's latent in symbolic action. So that's, just one other piece of this that I find interesting. Another one is, it sort of fits me, like it sort of fits me in this body at this point in my life. So my body as it is likes to walk. I'm still able to do it. There's lots of other things that I'm not able to do. But it's interesting, right? That's like how things come together in art or music, life, however we add meaning in our own lives, right? And then lastly, I think I've liked the sort of the journalism that's sort of it's kind of an added layer to the artwork. And I've found that as a nice way for me to kind of go back to that idea of, how do I add my voice to the many voices that make up the community. So, those are some of the things that I've been thinking about. And maybe at this point, let's open it up for a little conversation if people are interested. And so if there's anything in the chat, we'd start with that. And if not, and somebody has something they'd like to say, please do.
Yeah, it looks like no questions thus far in the chat.
I have a question, John, and I'm interested in your title, and I'm thinking, I wonder if you long for a kind of stillness. I certainly see the kind of unstillness that exists from your writing, but towards the end, when you were visiting the different places you worked, and when you were looking for the untrammeled source of water and not finding it, and the constant change, I'm wondering if part of what you would like is a kind of stillness, or whether you just think it's constant change and that's what it's about and get on with it.
Well, Marty, that's a very perceptive question. And I think the answer is both, because on a physical level, I seek the unstillness. So for you know, as I was saying a minute ago, this body as it is at this point in my life, movement is it's important. It feels like something that I want to make sure I can do as long as possible, et cetera, et cetera. So from on a physical level, I seek unstillness, but on a psychic level, you know, these quests certainly do reach for a more centered experience, and one that is, you know, I mean, I don't know if calm is too much to ask for, but you know, I think, you know, I'm a bad meditator, but I still try. And there are a lot of the ideas from meditation that are some of the groundwork in this work. But there's a great conflict too, because you know, you can't, you know, you can't walk to all the crime scenes in the neighborhood and think that's going to bring you peace. You know, that's, you know, it can add meaning to experience. It can help you understand how things are and consider what the possibilities might be for the future. And maybe that in the long run can lead to calm.
Yeah, it's
John.
helpful. Thanks.
John, could you share perhaps a favorite example of one of your quests or walks, or just the short story of maybe just one that sticks out in your mind?
Well, I think you know, there's several. If I sort of look at the types of walks that are in the book, there's a couple different kinds, and there are several which are a place where I examine myself and my movement in relation to the greater universe. So on solstice, when I spent the day walking toward the sun, or on the equinox, when I watched the sunrise at one end of the creek and walked to the other end of the creek, you know, 20 some miles later, and watched the sunset, those you know, are sort of filled with awe for, you know, what it means to be this tiny human in a grand universe. And in those kinds of walks, I think it's much more pure, right? Like, you know, I'm not taking on the heavy stuff, and it just feels good to, you know, to respect nature, I guess, through that. Thank you. So I have a question for people. How far do you have to walk before you start feeling better? If you go for a walk, if, you know, if something's, Andy, we can't hear you.
Oh, you're on mute, Andy.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, less than 5 minutes, just getting outdoors alone. We just had a brief walk this morning. And, you know, the sky is blue, the nice breeze. It didn't take long at all. And that's the beauty of it. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you.
I have to say it's kind of the same for me. If I do my 7-minute bike ride between work and home. It makes a world of difference compared to driving. Or just stepping outside is like the beginning. But I know that the longer I'm out there, the more benefit there is.
Yeah, for me, it's about 20 minutes. When things start to warm up, and then some of the other stuff starts to dissolve. Marty, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I agree with Pam and Andy. It's just a few minutes, and the kind of bad feelings of the pandemic go away. But I think if I walked where you walk, the murder sites, to some of the damage, I would just feel worse and worse and worse. And that, if I can ask one more question, it brought up, how do you choose where to walk? Why there rather than walking to escapes? Is there a moral imperative, do you think?
What does that mean, moral imperative?
That if you hole up and don't look at it and don't try to ignore it, you're failing in your responsibility as a citizen and as a moral agent.
Okay. Well, that's a good question. I do feel compelled to participate and to help and to act in some way relative to the things that I'm upset about. And so I guess I do feel that's part of it. That is part of it for me. How I decide what to walk, it all comes from the idea, right? Like that's the first thing that has to happen. And maybe that means this is conceptual art, and maybe it means it's not art at all. I'm not sure. But, I am constantly thinking about what is going to be an interesting inquiry for me to make as an artist through this form of art, which is a walking based artwork. And so it starts with the idea. And then once I have a good idea, I almost feel like I have to do it whether I want to or not. Like there was one of them in the book. I don't know, maybe it wasn't even in the book because like there's been 25 walks since the book. But it was based on the depolicing that was happening in the, and I was like, do I really have to do this? Right? Like, do I really have to, I just like, I don't want to do it, but then when you do and you discover something interesting, it feels worth it.
I've just got a quick reaction to what you say. And I can see you're feeling like you have to do it. And when I read that part of the book, I found it really kind of shattering in a way, just confronting it. And I realized that in my own life, I'd been avoiding that sort of thing. What was happening in Minneapolis, I live over in St. Paul in a pretty safe neighborhood where you can hole up. But I think John's right, I shouldn't be doing this. So,
all right.
but it's hard.
I came in late, so forgive me if you've already talked about this, but is there a pilgrimage aspect to what you're doing? And do you ever think about that tradition?
Yeah, I do. And one that comes to mind that is in the book, which I felt like was, fits the pilgrimage model, was the walk to Jasper Marsalis's stadium piece. So it was just a circle that had been dug out of the ground. And, that walk was to get to that point and to see what that felt like. And of course, there's an experience on the journey there. There's the time that you're in that space, and just existing within a circular architecture is not something that's very familiar to us, because everything is the grid of the city and the grid of the structures that we work and live in. And so it had kind of a profound effect on me. But I thought about that walk as a pilgrimage, because I knew that I had a destination in mind. There was something that I was going to go try to relate to and have it affect me.
What about the aspect of others having walked the same walk, or having been in your, that you're following other people's footsteps, or that others might follow yours?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a nice idea. I doubt that anybody's said, okay, he's done that walk, I'm going to go do it too. But I think, people will mentally do that, right? People say, okay, like, what would it be like for me to do that same walk? And that's interesting. I also like the fact that who hasn't gone for a walk, right? Like we all go for a walk. And, the fact that this can be art, is intriguing to me as well. But I like the question because in fact, I think I'm going to write this down, Deb, because I think there's an idea there about purposely and consciously taking a walk that many others have taken for a certain purpose. And look for my next book. If that ever happens. Yeah.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
So you mentioned pilgrimage in there. And while I was reading your book, and this is the little tangent here, I realized that several years ago, we walked the last 60 miles of the Camino de Santiago across the northern part of Spain. And what made this really fascinating for me was that we were walking with 6 or 8 old nuns, some of them very, very slow, one of which I ended up walking with side by side. My buddy and I alternated days walking with her because she only had one eye that worked. But what that forced me to do is walk slow.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, my background, I used to do a lot of running. And when you're running, you really don't see what's around you. But these 6 days across northern Spain there, my mantra when I came out of that was stop and smell the roses. Because when you're walking that slow, and really, it was really slow, you see stuff around you that you would never have seen before. And so that to me was just a real epiphany. It was just amazing to realize how much is out there in the world. But I sense that in your book, that your eyes are open, walking, and you said something about walking at a pace that feels comfortable to you. And anyway, so that was just one of my takeaways from your book.
Yeah, you were moving at observational speed, as I've discussed with others. A friend of mine had, I don't know, injured her knee or something, and she had to move at the speed of crutches. And that was, again, slower and more, opened up more possibility for observation.
Yeah.
And yeah, in fact, Lois, who's on the call, she and I have talked about observational speed too, because we've done a project recently, and I don't know if we want to talk about that, or if you think we if you have anything to say, Lois, but that's been a big part of our conversation too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, I've done just one of these walks, and I like to walk a lot. And during the pandemic, I would get out every day, but not with a, nothing beyond just a walk. So I asked John if I could participate on one of his walks at some point, and he extended, again, starting with an idea. And so he extended several ideas, and then we proceeded to do a walk together. But yeah, that observational speed, it's really, I don't know, a curious thing. And for our walk, I think we were using the tool of a rickshaw, where we would each pull each other. And so the observational speed was at each other's pace, where one of us would just be, riding and observing and taking in. And that was really curious, because I don't know except for when you're a child in a stroller, at what point you see the world at that slow speed.
Yeah, it was fascinating too, because there were sort of many layers to the walk. There was the rickshaw, which mediates the experience in several directions. One is that, you're so connected and so interdependent. And we were moving through a certain historical route in Milwaukee, with kind of wild Milwaukee weather and wild Milwaukee industrial skyline. And, these are the kinds of things that I really love about this kind of work, is that you're a little bit overwhelmed by all that's coming at you. And then you just try to make sense out of it. And so Lois and I are kind of in this stage of trying to make sense out of what we experienced. And we still have the second half of, we want to do another walk that goes in tandem with that first one. So, yeah. Anybody else have a comment or question?
I was curious, John, in reading the introduction, you mentioned you first started around 2018, sort of at a residency, seriously thinking about walking. And since that's almost now like 4 or 5 years ago, I wonder how your thoughts on walking have evolved since you started walking very consciously.
Yeah, so it's changed a lot. In part, like the whole journalistic aspect of it, to go out and investigate, do an investigative story maybe is more present. And also, that idea of feeling the change inside of myself and feeling the distance between myself and the situation. I'm more conscious about that now. And I think, of course I have more language to put around it, right? Like at first I didn't know what I was doing, right? Like you're just kind of trying some things out, and you don't know whether it's going to be successful. So, it's like now I have a way to generate ideas, like I have like some kind of little system for that. And but don't ask me what it is, because I probably can't tell you. And as I think about it, like, where does it take me in the future? I don't know. I have several ideas that I'm working on, and yeah, I don't know. Like I'll give you an example. So, I talked a minute ago about the symbolic action that's sort of latent in the work. And I've started to think about, well, like, could it be more than that, right? Like, could I actually try to press on those issues? So, you know, in the walk where I walked to find an unadulterated stream system and failed, but you know, what would happen if I started having meetings with development companies and talking with them and saying, like, does it really got to be this way? And, you know, and I called one, they said, yep, it does. And they, you know, and then I'm like, oh, okay, so, you know, is that the end of the story, you know? Or recently I walked around the lowest income neighborhood of Minneapolis and then around the highest income neighborhood of Minneapolis. And to do that walk it's once again a very, you know, it's a symbolic act, and it raises questions about, like, what would it take to unify these two communities? And is that even a good idea, right? Like, because potentially it's a terrible idea. But, you know, I think, like, well, what would happen if the two neighborhood associations had joint meetings? Like, what would that be about? And then I think, okay, well, like, am I interested to try and facilitate something like that? Am I interested to, you know, and I'm sort of trying to live with those questions and figure out, you know, what is the job that I'm willing to do? And the answer is not clear yet.
Thanks for that.
Yeah.
I have another question.
Yeah.
So going back to you and Lois, when you walked with a rickshaw, that just is very different than the solitary walks that you've taken, because it's you looking out at the world. But when I imagined the rickshaw was that you suddenly were something that people might be looking at, or maybe even a spectacle. And so I wondered, like, now that you're talking about these possibilities that come to mind, and, you know, maybe even you reaching out more, how is it different? How does it feel to be looked at versus looking out?
Yeah, I like that question, because I like thinking about that myself. First, I would say that I've done quite a number of walks where someone's participated with me, and I find them to be really, really valuable and sort of exciting for me to do. And I love to do the individual ones too, but I'm just saying that there's something extra that comes along when you collaborate with somebody on a project, and, you know, it just adds other dimensions to things. And so that's been really interesting and exciting, and something that I hope to do more of. You know, that question about when is a walk performative, and when is it some other kind of experience. And, you know, a lot of the walks are not performative at all, right? They're investigative, and, you know, there's some kind of solitary challenge that I set up for myself. But some walks do have a performative aspect. And in this, like, if we didn't have the rickshaw, nobody would have known we were doing it, right? And so, but you can't hide it, right? Like, it's big, and it's strange, and, you know, maybe it's the first rickshaw that ever got pulled in Milwaukee, for all we know, right? Like, it's you know, it's an unusual thing. And so, you know, you have to be ready for, you know, the fact that this thing is happening in the community, and people are likely to respond to it. And so, but there's other interesting things that happen. A friend of mine talks about the shield of the performance. And I certainly noticed that in a performative setting, right? Like, or sometimes I'm in the May Day parade, or, you know, those kinds of things. And like you're kind of protected by the performance in a way, right? Like I feel less vulnerable, in the performance for some reason. So I think I'm interested in it, like if it suits the mission of the walk, right? Like I'm probably not interested in a walk where I add a performative aspect just to add it, right? Like that doesn't mean anything to me. But if it's integral to what's happening, I think it's valuable. Anybody else with a question or comment? Well, I have another question for us. How do you think a walk inhabits the body? Or doesn't it?
I think it does, just through like the physical benefits, what it does for your heart, your muscles, your lungs.
Mm-hmm.
I can connect with that in terms of some of my repeated daily walks. Like I don't know if I inhabit the walk, but I know my body recognizes different elements. Like here we go down the hill, and here's that recognizable turn where the sun's not in my eyes anymore, or things like that. That's how I would interpret.
Yeah, so I suppose body memory is another word, right, for it. One of my earliest walks, which wasn't documented in the book, was there were 4 small islands in Rainy Lake, and I walked the edge of each island as close to the water as I could without falling in. And then I would draw a map based on that walk, and then I would compare it to a satellite image. And I was pretty close on all 4 islands. In some cases, I would be dimensionally off, right? Like, my version of the island would be fatter than it was in real life or something like that. But in some cases, I would say, I know I'm right, where it would, and I would go back and look, and I was right, and the satellite image was wrong. And of course, the only reason it was wrong was because the water was higher or lower or something that year, right? And I don't know whether this is just me or whether this is a capacity that we all have, but I felt like my body memory was pretty accurate if I really wanted to pay attention to it, right? Like I had to do that intentionally and know that's what I was trying to do, so that I would try to remember where the turns and curves were on each of these islands. But if I set out to do that, it was pretty close. So, I guess, and that kind of leads to another question, is that, how does that walk inhabit the body? Or maybe it's, how does a drawing inhabit the body? Those are other questions that I think about in this. All right. Anybody else with a comment or question?
Well, just kind of a comment, John. The pandemic will go down in history as one of those weirdest times in our current lives. But what I've noticed, and I'm sure you all have too, is everyone's walking now. I mean, we have a little trailhead across the street from my house, and I've seen people going through there daily now that I never saw before. And, as a way the pandemic created this. It got people out of their house. We've got to get out of the house, honey. And they would go, families go by with a dog and two kids, just repetitively, day after day after day after day. And that's one of the fringe benefits of the pandemic, if you could call it that.
Right. I have noticed that too. Marty?
I've got a specific question that's been kind of eating at me, quite apart from the tremendous emotional experience of the book. And that's on page 22 for the May Day parade. You fill in figures that might have been there, but there's also a moose and what looks like an alligator on a skateboard.
Oh,
Why?
yeah.
How are those figures there?
Well, have you seen the May Day parade?
No.
Ah, okay.
Ah, that's why, eh?
Yeah, so the May Day parade is always populated by creatures who, help enact the story of the parade. And each year the parade has kind of a different story that it tells. But there's always animals, and sometimes it's moose, and sometimes it's crows, and sometimes it's fish, and it could be any kind of creature. And so that's why the creatures are in that drawing.
Thanks, John. It won't eat at me anymore.
Right. All right. Happy to help. Yeah.
Johnny, I just wanted to mention one other kind of walking, and that's the Labyrinth that I really enjoy doing at a couple of different locations here in town, that we have them outside as well as in some church basements. But that is that repetitive memory opening up type feeling.
Yeah, I don't know that there's many of those in the Twin Cities. I don't know of them. And when you walk that, is it just once through, or do you do it multiple times?
Depending on time, but I have done it several hours almost, that you just keep going around and around and around. And like you mentioned, the sun is in your eyes different times and different skies and different breezes and whatever. So it's very meditative.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we probably still have a minute left, so I could tell you, and I'm not going to keep people too long, but I could tell you a little bit about a couple of recent walks, which just sort of bring us up to date. Maybe even I'll share my screen. If Amy, can you allow me? All right, it says you just disabled it.
Oh, sorry about that. Working.
Well, it's okay. It's not required. So, what are the current events? I respond to those. One of them is, Russia's horrific attack on Ukraine. And so I did a walk to the Russian Museum to think about that, and forced myself to do a bunch of reading about the history that kind of brought us up to that situation. And I just examined it from the perspective of Russian art. And the Russian Museum in the Twin Cities is considered to be, perhaps the most definitive collection of Russian realism and impressionism in the country. And it's a fabulous museum, and the art's beautiful. But you don't find any of the horrors of war in that collection. And that's because, for two reasons. One is that kind of artwork was suppressed in recent Russian history. And secondly is it's probably not as saleable. And the museum was built on the proceeds of a gallery that brought Russian Impressionism into the US and sold it at extremely high levels of profit. I remember I once met with one of the principals, and he said that the profit levels were obscene. And, I believe that to be true. So I kind of tie that sort of history into the history of what's happening in this war, and then relate it to what's happened in this country. And people probably know, up until the war, and we don't have data since, but up until the war, Putin was by far the most popular leader that Russia's had in centuries. He had over a 70% approval rating among the Russian people. And, I think about that, right? Like, well, why is that? And the answer is that he is seen as somebody who restored Russia to superpower status. And he led them out of the economic turmoil of the 90s, when the chaos of Boris Yeltsin and the rapid encroachment of capitalism and all the turmoil that caused. Putin became a national hero. And so the question that I ask in that walk is, if the circumstances were the same in the US, would the American people have supported this kind of tyrant? And I think the answer is yes, right? The people in the US elected Trump, and I would argue he is that kind of tyrant. And if he were credited with restoring the country to, if he really and truly led an economic recovery that was as dramatic as the one that happened in Russia, he'd be a hero. And so, like, this is a human problem. And so that's just an example of one of the walks that I did recently. And I'll give one more example, and then we can probably just wrap up. But I look at global issues in these walks. I look at very local issues, and the one locally that I did recently with a friend was we decided to walk down Lake Street and stop at every store that sold groceries and buy something, and then each go home and make dinners out of what we bought. And so Lake Street, for those who are not from the Twin Cities, is a very it was heavily impacted by the destruction, right? It was ground zero for the destruction after the murder of George Floyd, and many buildings were burned down to the ground. Some have been restored, some have not. It's also been kind of an area of the city which has had its problems in terms of drug trafficking and gun violence and everything else, but it's also a very vibrant part of the city where there are all kinds of markets. And so when we did this walk, we only walked half of the street, and we found like 20 stores that sold groceries, and bought things that I just wasn't familiar with. And then you have to go home and try to make something out of it. And so it was really fascinating. And we met people along the way, and the storekeepers, were happy to tell us, what it was we were buying. And it was just a really interesting way to participate in the community that I live in it's 8 blocks away. So it's not far away. But it is a deeper window into a place and the community. And yeah, it was really fascinating.
Oh.
So yeah, those are a couple of current walks. Does anybody else have a comment or question before we wrap up?
It looks like there's a question in the chat from Chris. Can you speak to one of your relatives in the field, the British land artist, Richard Long?
Yeah, fabulous artist, right? And for people who don't know his work, he's credited with being perhaps one of the first conceptual artists to use walking as part of his artistic practice. And he has this really great piece where he walked through a field and probably walked back and forth a couple times, and the weeds and things are just stepped down, and he took a photograph of it, and it became this famous piece that that a lot of us are familiar with and think is pretty great, and other people think is like stupid and anybody could do that, and why would that count as art, right? And that's that's part of the reason it's art, because it gets that reaction. But he also has done a lot of things where he collects objects from the environment that he walks in, or he collects clay and then builds installations out of those things. So yeah, I think like I'd read about him maybe 20 or 30 years ago, and then forgot, didn't remember him. And then I started doing the walking projects, and then I don't know if I remembered him again, or if like somebody pointed his work back out, and so I went back through it. But is there a relationship to what he's doing? Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, I had to step out for a minute. So I don't know if you guys talked about this already, but if you did, just don't mind my intervention. I think one of the most interesting walks to me that you do and you have in this book is the Precinct perimeter walk. I think those are like sort of bureaucratic borders, man-made borders, right? That kind of overlap with other man-made borders, which is like the grid of the city. If you live in a place that is perhaps maybe has roads that are still around and older than the ones that we have here in Minneapolis, then you won't have that kind of grid, right? If you live somewhere where like roads were made for horses and they're still the same roads, it will be feel less oppressive. But I really found very interesting, like your kind of shift in that perspective from something that is supposed to be viewed from the top, disregarding who's there and what's there in a way. And then you like approach it from sort of like a perspective of experience. Like, I'm going to walk that line to see if like, what is the reason that this border is here, right? So I found that like taking a map and then walking that map instead of making the map very interesting, especially for understanding the structures that we live in and maybe try to figure out why they exist.
Yeah, I do think a lot about that. And another thing that I notice when I do that kind of work, where I walk the edge of something, is that you discover that territory is very different from other parts of that area where you are walking, right? So the edge of something has a different kind of, different kinds of structure, different kinds of nature, different kinds of social interactions that happen on the edges than happen in the center. So you walk the edge of a neighborhood, or you walk the edge, it's very different than walking through the middle of it. So for example, I talked earlier about the wealthiest neighborhood in Minneapolis and the lowest income neighborhood in Minneapolis. The wealthiest neighborhood is bounded on 3 sides by water, and the lowest income neighborhood is bounded on 3 sides by major highways. And so those territories, where you're walking along the highway or where you're walking along the lake, are very different than like what's happening at the inside. And then maybe, more directly to, speak to what you're saying, Zoe, that the grid of the city is part of what has to be navigated in these walks. So like in the one where I followed, where I walked toward the sun for the whole day, of course you can't exactly do that because you have to stay on the grid of the city. But over the length of that, which was a long walk, like 23 or 24 miles, something like that, still that perfect arc formed, but you were always going against the grid, right? Like I had to, go off track and get back on track in order to, do the walk. All right. Well, does anybody else have a question? And I can just say that I'm really grateful to each of you for being here. And, it helps me think about what I'm doing. And all of your comments are super helpful. I think any artist is super grateful when people share their responses. So thank you for that. And thank you, Zoe, for, it was her idea that we do this. So thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, John, so much for sharing your time with us today. Thank you all for being here. Again, the exhibition Walk With Us is on view now at the Rochester Art Center through early October. So do make the trip down from the cities if you're in the region. If you are beyond the region, thank you for checking out John's book. And thanks for joining us today. Thank you, John, for your time.
Yeah. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Safe travels to Iceland.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. See ya.
Yeah.